My name is Aria Blackstone, and this is the story of how I went from being called replaceable to replacing the man who said it. The fluorescent lights of Stratton and Hale Consulting buzzed overhead like angry wasps as I stared at the email that would change everything. 26 years old, sitting in a cramped cubicle at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, I had just received confirmation that would make my blood boil for months to come. The Meridian Industries contract, $25 million, had been approved. I had secured it. I had worked 18-hour days for 3 months straight. I had crafted every proposal, attended every meeting, and convinced every stakeholder. But tomorrow morning, I already knew what would happen. Richard Halden would stride into that boardroom like a conquering king and claim it all as his own. The cursor blinked mockingly on my computer screen as I saved the final client documents. My hands were trembling, not from exhaustion, but from something far more dangerous. Something that had been building inside me for 3 long, brutal years. Rage. Pure, crystalline rage that cut through my chest like broken glass. When I first walked through those mahogany doors of Stratton and Hale Consulting, I believed in merit. I believed that hard work, dedication, and results would speak for themselves. I believed that if I proved myself valuable enough, indispensable enough, brilliant enough, I would finally earn the respect I deserved. How naive I had been. How wonderfully, tragically naive. Richard Halden had other plans for me. From my very first day, he made sure I understood exactly where I stood in his carefully constructed hierarchy. I was not an asset. I was not a protégé. I was not even a colleague. I was a tool. A convenient, disposable tool that he could use and discard whenever it suited his purposes. "You are lucky to even be here," he would tell me during our weekly one-on-ones, leaning back in his leather chair with that infuriating smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "This industry chews up and spits out people twice as qualified as you every single day." But luck had nothing to do with it. I had graduated summa cum laude from Wharton. I had completed 3 internships at Fortune 500 companies before I turned 25. I spoke 4 languages fluently and had closed more deals in my first year than most senior consultants managed in 3. Yet somehow, in Richard's version of reality, I was just a fortunate accident. The office was eerily quiet as I gathered my things that night. The cleaning crew had already made their rounds, leaving behind the artificial scent of lemon disinfectant and the ghostly echo of vacuum cleaners. My heels clicked against the marble floors as I made my way to the elevator, each step reverberating through the empty corridors like a countdown. I did not know it then, but I was counting down to war. The next morning arrived with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. I had barely settled at my desk with my coffee when Richard's voice boomed across the office floor. "Emergency board meeting in 15 minutes. Conference room A." My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what this was about. I watched from my desk as Richard straightened his Italian silk tie and smoothed back his silver hair. At 53, he still carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. His suit probably cost more than most people made in a month, and he wore it like armor. But armor could be pierced. The boardroom was a temple to corporate power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline, while the massive oak table reflected the faces of 9 board members like a dark mirror. I had been in this room dozens of times before, but always as a silent observer, a note-taker, a ghost haunting the edges of real power. Today would be different. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice carrying that practiced confidence that had charmed clients and intimidated subordinates for decades. "I am pleased to announce that we have secured the most significant contract in Stratton and Hale's 40-year history." He clicked to the first slide of his presentation. The Meridian Industries logo filled the screen, bold and imposing against a pristine white background. $25 million over 3 years, he continued, allowing a dramatic pause for the impressed murmurs from the board. "This contract will not only ensure our financial stability, but position us as the premier consulting firm on the East Coast." I felt my hands clench into fists beneath the table. Board member Victoria Sterling leaned forward, her steel-gray eyes sharp with interest. "This is remarkable, Richard. How did you manage to outbid Morrison and Associates? They have been pursuing Meridian for over a year." Richard smiled, and in that smile, I saw the death of my naive faith in corporate fairness. Vision, he said simply. While our competitors were playing it safe with traditional approaches, I developed a revolutionary growth strategy that spoke directly to Meridian's long-term goals. They did not just want a consulting firm. They wanted a partner who could think beyond conventional limitations. Every word was a knife twisting deeper into my chest. I had developed that growth strategy. I had spent countless nights researching Meridian's market position, analyzing their competitors, identifying opportunities that no one else had noticed. I had crafted the presentation that had convinced their CEO to choose us over 7 other firms. And now Richard was presenting it as his own masterpiece. The key breakthrough came during my personal meeting with CEO Marcus Thornfield, Richard continued, his voice growing more animated with each fabrication. When I explained how we could leverage their existing infrastructure to penetrate 3 new markets simultaneously, he knew he had found the right partner. Another lie. I had been the one sitting across from Marcus Thornfield in that sterile conference room, laying out detailed projections and case studies while Richard had been playing golf with his country club friends. Board member James Crawford nodded approvingly. Your leadership continues to set the standard for this industry, Richard. This is exactly the kind of visionary thinking that makes Stratton and Hale irreplaceable. Speaking of irreplaceable, Richard said, his eyes finding mine across the room with predatory precision, I want to acknowledge the support team that helped bring this vision to life. My heart hammered against my ribs as he continued. Our research department provided valuable data analysis, our administrative staff ensured all documentation was properly filed, and our junior associates. He paused, that infuriating smile growing wider. Our junior associates did an adequate job with the more routine aspects of the project. Adequate. 3 months of my life, reduced to adequate. However, Richard continued, turning back to the board with renewed authority, this kind of strategic thinking, this level of client relationship management, this is why leadership matters. This is why experience cannot be replaced by enthusiasm alone. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, but I heard none of it. My mind had retreated to a place of cold calculation, where emotions were data points and revenge was simply another form of strategic planning. As the board members filed out, congratulating Richard on his brilliant achievement, I remained seated, my hands folded carefully in my lap. Richard noticed. Something wrong, Arya? He asked, his tone carrying that familiar condescension that had become the soundtrack to my professional humiliation. I looked up at him, this man who had stolen my work, my achievements, my very identity within this company. And for the first time in 3 years I smiled back. Not at all, Richard. I was just thinking about growth strategies. Something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps. Or maybe just annoyance that I had not immediately scurried back to my desk like a scolded child. Good, he said after a moment. Because we have another big project coming up, and I will need all hands on deck. The Morrison and Associates account that just opened up. I think it might be a good opportunity for you to learn something. Learn something. As if I were still the wide-eyed graduate student who had walked through these doors 3 years ago. I would be delighted to contribute, I said, my voice steady as granite. Richard nodded and turned to leave, but I was not finished. Richard? He paused at the doorway, looking back with barely concealed impatience. Congratulations on the Meridian contract. You must be feeling irreplaceable right about now. His smile returned, sharp and self-satisfied. That is exactly the word I would use, Arya. Irreplaceable. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving me alone in the boardroom with my reflection staring back from that dark oak table. Irreplaceable. The word echoed in my mind as I finally stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched out below me, a vast network of ambition and power struggles, victories and defeats. Somewhere in those glass towers, other young professionals were fighting their own battles against arrogant bosses and systemic inequality. But this was my battle, and I was going to win it. That evening, I did something I had never done before. Instead of going straight home to my small apartment with its second-hand furniture and view of the neighboring building's brick wall, I took a detour. I walked through the financial district, past the gleaming lobbies of investment firms and law offices, past the restaurants where deals worth millions were negotiated over expensive wine and imported steaks, past the luxury car dealerships where people like Richard purchased vehicles that cost more than most families earned in 3 years. I walked until my feet ached and my mind cleared. And then I went home and began to plan. The first rule of warfare is to know your enemy. Over the next few weeks, I made it my mission to understand every aspect of Richard's professional life. His habits, his weaknesses, his relationships, his fears. I discovered that he arrived at the office every morning at exactly 7:15, always carrying a large coffee from the same shop 3 blocks away. He spent the first hour of each day reviewing industry publications and responding to emails, using this time to craft the image of a hands-on leader who was always first to know about market developments. But I also discovered something more interesting. Richard's assistant, Melissa Chin, had been with the company for 8 years. She was brilliant, organized, and completely invisible to him. He treated her like a particularly efficient piece of office equipment, never bothering to learn about her background or acknowledge her contributions. This was a mistake. Melissa had an MBA from Columbia. She spoke Mandarin, Spanish, and German fluently. She had been managing Richard's calendar, screening his calls, and essentially running his professional life for nearly a decade. And she was tired of being overlooked. "He does not even know I have a master's degree," she told me one evening as we worked late on yet another project that Richard would claim credit for. Last week, he asked me to explain what gross margin meant, because he had forgotten, and did not want to look stupid in front of the Peterson Industries team. I filed this information away carefully. Over the following months, I began building something that Richard had never bothered to create. Actual relationships with the people who made Stratton and Hale function. The research team, led by brilliant analyst Kai Nakamura, had been producing industry reports that were consistently ahead of market trends. But Richard barely glanced at their work, preferring to rely on his instincts and decades of experience. The client services manager, Zoe Patel, had been quietly preventing disasters for years. When Richard's arrogance offended potential clients, Zoe would smooth things over with her diplomatic skills and genuine expertise. When his promises exceeded what the company could deliver, Zoe would find creative solutions that satisfied everyone involved. The financial controller, Marcus Rivera, had been watching Richard's expense account with growing concern. Business lunches at 5-star restaurants, first-class flights to conferences where Richard spent more time networking than learning, company credit cards used for personal purchases that were then creatively categorized as business expenses. None of these brilliant, dedicated professionals had ever been invited to Richard's leadership meetings. Their insights were never solicited for major strategic decisions. They were simply expected to execute his vision without question or input. This was another mistake. I spent months listening to their frustrations, their ideas, their dreams for what Stratton and Hale could become under different leadership. I learned about the clients they had lost due to Richard's ego, the talented employees who had quit rather than continue working under his toxic management style, the opportunities that had been missed because he was too proud to admit when he did not understand something. And slowly, carefully, I began building alliances. Not through manipulation or false promises, but through something Richard had never offered them: respect. I asked for their opinions. I acknowledged their expertise. I credited their contributions in emails and meetings, even when Richard was not paying attention. Especially when Richard was not paying attention. But I also began documenting everything. Every time Richard took credit for someone else's work, I saved the email trail that proved the real source of the idea. Every time he made a promise to a client without consulting the team responsible for delivery, I kept records of the scrambling and overtime required to make good on his commitments. Every time he dismissed a colleague's suggestion only to present a nearly identical plan weeks later as his own insight, I preserved the evidence. I built a comprehensive database of Richard's professional misconduct, not because I was planning to destroy him through scandal, but because I knew that eventually, the board would need to see the truth about their irreplaceable CEO. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 6 months after the Meridian Industries contract, our biggest competitor, Morrison & Associates, began making aggressive moves to poach our top clients. They were offering lower rates, faster delivery times, and a level of personalized attention that we had been struggling to match under Richard's increasingly absent leadership. We lost 3 major accounts in 2 weeks. The board called an emergency meeting, and for the first time since I had started at Stratton and Hale, I saw genuine concern in their eyes when they looked at Richard. "This is a temporary setback," Richard assured them, his usual confidence sounding forced and hollow. "Morrison is engaging in unsustainable pricing practices. They will burn through their venture capital funding within 6 months and come crawling back to realistic market rates." Board member Victoria Sterling was not convinced. "Richard, we cannot afford to lose any more accounts while waiting for Morrison to fail. We need a proactive response strategy, not wishful thinking." "I have been developing a comprehensive counter-strategy," Richard lied smoothly. "Give me 2 weeks to finalize the details, and I will present a plan that will not only win back our lost clients, but position us to dominate the market for the next decade." The board agreed, but I could see the skepticism in their faces. Richard had 2 weeks to develop a strategy he had not even begun to conceptualize. I had 2 weeks to prepare for the most important presentation of my life. That night, I stayed in the office until dawn, not working on Richard's phantom strategy, but developing my own vision for the future of Stratton and Hale Consulting. I analyzed our competitors' moves, identified their weaknesses, and crafted a response that would neutralize their advantages while leveraging our company's unique strengths. I reached out to former clients who had jumped ship to Morrison, conducting informal interviews to understand exactly what we had failed to provide. The feedback was consistent and damning. They did not leave because of price. They left because they felt ignored, undervalued, and frustrated by our company's arrogant assumption that they had no other options. They left because of Richard. Over the next 13 days, I worked with Kai's research team to develop market projections that would support my recommendations. I collaborated with Zoe to design a client retention program that would rebuild damaged relationships. I consulted with Marcus to ensure that my financial projections were realistic and sustainable. And most importantly, I convinced them to present these findings themselves at the board meeting. Not as my subordinates implementing my vision, but as the experts they truly were, sharing insights that deserve to be heard at the highest levels of corporate decision-making. Richard, meanwhile, spent those 2 weeks playing golf and attending networking events, confident that his reputation and charm would carry him through whatever presentation he managed to cobble together at the last minute. This was his final mistake. The morning of the board meeting, I arrived at the office at 6 a.m. to find Richard pacing frantically in his office, surrounded by scattered papers and empty coffee cups. He looked like a man who had finally realized that his decades of professional negligence were about to catch up with him. "Aria," he called out when he saw me through his glass door. "Perfect timing. I need you to pull together some materials for the presentation today." I knocked and entered his office, taking in the chaos with carefully concealed satisfaction. "What kind of materials are you looking for?" I asked. "Client retention statistics, competitive analysis, maybe some projections for the next quarter. Nothing too complicated. I just need some slides to support the strategy one will be presenting." "And what strategy is that?" Richard paused, his eyes darting away from mine. "The comprehensive counter-strategy I mentioned to the board. The one that will address the Morrison situation." "Of course. Would you like me to prepare a summary of your main points so I can find supporting materials?" Another pause, longer this time. "Just put together whatever you think would be relevant. You know how these presentations work." I nodded and turned to leave, but Richard called out again. "And Aria? Make sure the slides look professional. This presentation is crucial for the company's future." "I understand completely," I replied. "The company's future depends on today's presentation." I spent the morning in conference room B with Kai, Zoe, Marcus, and Melissa, making final preparations for what we had privately begun calling the reckoning. Each team member had prepared a section of our comprehensive response strategy, backed by weeks of research and analysis. Kai had developed a competitive positioning framework that would differentiate us from Morrison's aggressive pricing model. Zoe had designed a client relationship management system that would prevent future defections. Marcus had created financial projections showing how we could maintain profitability while investing in the improvements our clients demanded. And I had prepared something special for the conclusion. At 2 o'clock, the board members filed into conference room A for what they expected to be Richard's make-or-break presentation. Richard himself arrived 5 minutes late, carrying a hastily assembled folder and projecting false confidence like a shield. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I want to thank you for your patience as we navigate this temporary challenge. Today, I am going to share a strategy that will not only solve our immediate problems but establish Stratton and Hale as the undisputed leader in our industry." He clicked to his first slide, which contained nothing but the company logo and the words "Competitive Response Strategy" in a generic font. "Our analysis has shown that Morrison & Associates is engaging in predatory pricing practices that cannot be sustained long-term," he continued, clicking to a slide that displayed a single graph with no source citations or supporting data. I watched the board members' faces as Richard stumbled through 15 minutes of vague generalizations, unsupported claims, and recycled talking points from previous presentations. Victoria Sterling's expression grew increasingly skeptical. James Crawford checked his phone twice. Other board members exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their diminishing confidence in Richard's leadership. When he finished, the room was silent for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Thank you, Richard," Victoria finally said. "Do you have any supporting documentation for these projections? Specific action items? Timeline for implementation?" Richard's confidence cracked visibly. "Of course. My team has been working on the detailed implementation plan. Arya, would you mind sharing the materials we discussed?" All eyes turned to me as I stood and moved to the front of the room. "Actually," I said, "I would like to suggest a different approach entirely." Richard's face went pale. "What do you mean, different approach?" "I mean that instead of reacting to Morrison's moves, we should be proactively addressing the underlying reasons why our clients are leaving us in the first place." I clicked to my first slide, which displayed the results of my client interviews in stark, undeniable detail. Over the past 2 weeks, I conducted exit interviews with the decision-makers at companies that recently terminated their contracts with us. The feedback was surprisingly consistent. I clicked to the next slide, which showed a word cloud of the most frequently cited concerns. Words like unresponsive, arrogant, and inflexible dominated the display. "They did not leave because of pricing," I continued. "They left because they felt that we had stopped listening to their needs and started taking their business for granted." Richard tried to interrupt. "Arya, I do not think this is the appropriate forum for—" "Let her continue," Victoria said firmly. I clicked to the next slide, which outlined Kai's competitive analysis. "Our research team has identified 3 key areas where Morrison is outperforming us, and none of them have to do with pricing." Kai stood and presented his findings with the expertise that Richard had been ignoring for years. The board members leaned forward, asking detailed questions about market positioning and competitive advantages that Kai answered with impressive depth and precision. When he finished, Zoe presented her client relationship management program. Then Marcus shared his financial projections, demonstrating how we could invest in client satisfaction while maintaining healthy profit margins. Finally, I clicked to my concluding slide. This comprehensive strategy addresses the root causes of our client retention problems while positioning us for sustainable long-term growth. But more importantly, it leverages the expertise and insights of team members who have been developing these solutions for months. I paused, looking directly at Richard. Team members whose contributions have been consistently overlooked by our current leadership structure. The silence in the room was deafening. Board member Thomas Wright spoke first. This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need. Why have we not seen this level of analysis before?" "Because," I said carefully, "our current leadership model does not encourage input from the people who work most directly with clients and market data." Richard finally found his voice. "Now wait just a minute. This presentation is based on work that my team did under my direction. Just because I delegate the technical details does not mean—" "Actually, Richard," Melissa interrupted, standing with a folder in her hands, "I think the board should see this." She distributed copies of the email trail I had helped her compile, showing the origins of every idea, every analysis, and every recommendation in our presentation. These documents show the actual source of the strategic insights that have been presented today, she said, as well as a pattern of credit misattribution that has been ongoing for several years. Richard's face went from pale to red as the board members reviewed the evidence. "This is highly inappropriate," he sputtered. "These junior employees are obviously trying to undermine my leadership by providing the strategic thinking that your leadership has been lacking?" Victoria Sterling's voice cut through his protests like ice. She looked around the table at her fellow board members, then back at Richard. "I think we need to discuss this privately. Richard, please step out for a moment." "Step out? This is my company. I built this firm from nothing. I am not going to be dismissed by a group of junior employees with delusions of grandeur." The room erupted, but not in Richard's favor. "Your company?" James Crawford's voice rose above the others. "Richard, you are an employee of this firm, just like everyone else in this room. The board of directors owns this company, and we make decisions based on what is best for our shareholders and clients." "Exactly," Victoria added. "And what is best for this company is leadership that can adapt to changing market conditions and leverage the full potential of our team." Richard looked around the room desperately, searching for allies who no longer existed. "You cannot do this," he said, his voice cracking. "I closed the Meridian deal. I brought in $25 million. Actually," I said quietly, "I closed the Meridian deal. And I have the documentation to prove it." I handed Victoria another folder, this one containing copies of every email, every meeting note, and every client communication related to the Meridian Industries contract, including recordings of the client calls where I presented the growth strategy that convinced them to choose us over Morrison and Associates. Richard stared at me with something approaching hatred. "You recorded our client calls?" "I recorded my client calls," I corrected. "The calls where I was the primary point of contact, and you were either absent or contributed nothing of substance to the conversation." The boardroom felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. Victoria Sterling stood up, her decision clearly made. "Richard, I am going to ask you again to step outside so the board can deliberate. And if I refuse? Then security will escort you out, and your employment with this firm will be terminated immediately for insubordination." Richard looked around the room one final time, his empire crumbling around him like a house built on sand. "Fine," he said. "But you are making a mistake. These people." He gestured at Kai, Zoe, Marcus, Melissa, and me. "These people do not have what it takes to run a company. They are followers, not leaders. They need someone like me to give them direction." "We will see about that," Victoria replied. Richard stormed out, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. The board deliberated for exactly 27 minutes. When they called us back into the room, Victoria Sterling was standing at the head of the table with a document in her hands. "After reviewing the evidence presented today, the board has voted to terminate Richard Halden's employment as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately." My heart stopped beating. "Furthermore, we have voted to promote Arya Blackstone to the position of Chief Executive Officer, with Kai Nakamura as Head of Strategic Analysis, Zoe Patel as Director of Client Relations, Marcus Rivera as Chief Financial Officer, and Melissa Chin as Chief Operating Officer." The room spun around me. The board recognizes that this leadership team has demonstrated the strategic thinking, collaborative approach, and client focus that this company needs to compete in today's market. Victoria handed me the document, which contained my new employment contract. "Congratulations, Arya. We look forward to seeing what you and your team can accomplish." I stared at the paper in my hands, unable to fully process what had just happened. 6 hours ago, I had been a junior associate whose contributions were dismissed as adequate. Now I was the CEO of Stratton and Hale Consulting. The rest of the day passed in a blur of handshakes, congratulations, and logistical discussions about the transition. The board members left around 5 o'clock, promising to announce the leadership changes to the rest of the company first thing Monday morning. As the sun set over the city, I found myself alone in Richard's former office. My office, staring out at the skyline that had witnessed so many corporate battles and victories. The mahogany desk felt surreal beneath my hands. The leather chair still held the impression of Richard's body, but it was adjusting to mine. A knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. "Come in," I called. Melissa entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing a smile that I had never seen before. "I thought you might need some caffeine," she said, setting 1 cup on the desk. "It has been quite a day." "That is an understatement," I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness. "Can I ask you something?" Melissa said. "Of course." "How long have you been planning this?" I considered the question carefully. I was not planning to become CEO, if that is what you mean. I was just planning to stop letting him steal credit for my work. "But you knew this might happen." "I hoped it might happen, but I was prepared to be satisfied with just getting the recognition I deserved." Melissa nodded. "Richard underestimated you. All of us, really." "No," I said. "Richard never saw us at all. To him, we were just tools to be used when convenient and ignored when not. He could not conceive of us as actual people with our own ideas and ambitions." "His loss," Melissa said. "His loss," I agreed. The next morning was Saturday, but I came into the office anyway. I needed time to process the magnitude of what had happened, and to begin planning for the challenges ahead. I was surprised to find that I was not alone. Kai was in the research department, working on competitive analysis reports. Zoe was in her office, calling clients to schedule meetings for the following week. Marcus was reviewing financial statements and budget projections. We were all here, on our own time, because we finally had the opportunity to implement the changes we had been dreaming about for months. Around 10 o'clock, as I was reviewing our current client contracts, my assistant buzzed the intercom. "Ms. Blackstone? There is someone here to see you." "Who is it?" "Richard Halden." My blood turned to ice water. "Send him in." I stood behind my desk as Richard entered the office. He looked older somehow, as if the events of yesterday had aged him several years overnight. His usually impeccable appearance was disheveled, his tie askew, his hair uncombed. "Hello, Richard." "Aria." His voice was flat, emotionless. "I came to collect my personal items." "Of course. Take all the time you need." He moved to the credenza behind the desk and began removing framed photos, awards, and personal mementos. I watched him work, feeling an unexpected pang of, not sympathy exactly, but recognition of his humanity. This office had been his domain for over a decade. These awards represented achievements that, regardless of how he had claimed credit for other people's work, had required some level of skill and effort. When he finished packing his belongings into a cardboard box, he turned to face me. "I suppose you feel pretty proud of yourself." "I feel like justice was served." "Justice?" He laughed bitterly. "You destroyed my career over petty office politics." "I presented evidence of your professional conduct to the board of directors. They made their decision based on that evidence." "My professional conduct was building this company into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Everything you achieved here, you achieved because of the foundation I created." I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had shaped so much of my professional life through his casual cruelty and systematic dismissal of my contributions. "You are right about one thing," I said finally. "I did learn from you. I learned exactly what kind of leader I never want to become." Richard's jaw tightened. "You think you can do better?" "I know I can do better, because I understand something that you never did." "Which is?" "That the people who work for you are not tools to be used. They are partners in building something bigger than any one person could create alone." Richard shook his head. "Idealistic nonsense. In 5 years, when you have had to make the hard decisions, when you have had to choose between being liked and being effective, you will understand why leadership requires a firm hand." "Maybe. But I doubt I will ever understand why leadership requires taking credit for other people's work." He had no answer for that. Richard picked up his box of personal belongings and walked toward the door. But before leaving, he turned back one final time. "You know what the worst part is, Aria?" "What?" I actually respected your work. I knew you were talented. But talent is not enough in this business. You need ruthlessness. You need the ability to make decisions that others cannot make. Like the decision to steal credit from the people who trusted you? Like the decision to do whatever is necessary to protect the company's interests. Whose company, Richard? Because yesterday, the board made it very clear that this company belongs to the shareholders, not to you. Richard's face flushed red. Do you really think the board cares about you? Do you think they promoted you because they believe in your leadership? They promoted you because you were convenient. Because you helped them get rid of a CEO they were planning to replace anyway. Maybe. But at least they promoted someone who actually did the work instead of just claiming credit for it. Richard stared at me for several seconds, then walked out without another word. I heard his footsteps echoing down the hallway, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. Then I sat down in my chair, put my head in my hands, and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full emotional weight of what had happened. Fear, excitement, uncertainty, vindication, responsibility, and beneath it all, a fierce determination to prove that Richard had been wrong about everything. Monday morning brought new challenges and new opportunities. I called an all-hands meeting for 9 a.m., giving everyone in the company a chance to meet their new leadership team and understand our vision for the future. The main conference room was packed. Some faces showed curiosity, others skepticism, and a few outright hostility from Richard's remaining allies. Good morning, everyone, I began. I know that Friday's leadership changes have raised questions about the direction of this company. I want to address those questions directly and transparently. I clicked to my first slide, which displayed our client retention statistics for the past year. We lost 6 major clients in the past 4 months. Not because of pricing, not because of market conditions, but because we stopped listening to their needs and started taking their business for granted. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but I pressed on. Under our new leadership structure, every department will have direct input into strategic decisions. No more top-down mandates. No more ideas dismissed without consideration. No more taking credit for work you did not do. The room fell silent. I know some of you are wondering if someone my age can handle the responsibilities of leading this company. That is a fair question. But I would ask you to judge me not by my age, but by my results. I clicked to the next slide, showing the Meridian Industries contract timeline and my documented role in securing it. The $25 million Meridian deal that saved this company's financial future? I developed the strategy, managed the client relationship, and closed the contract. The growth projections that convinced them to choose us over Morrison and Associates? I created those projections based on 6 months of research and market analysis. The silence grew heavier. I am not sharing this information to diminish anyone else's contributions, but to establish that your new CEO has been doing CEO-level work for quite some time. The only difference is that now I will receive credit for it. A hand shot up in the back of the room. David Chun from the marketing department. What about the employees who supported Richard? Are we going to be punished for not joining your campaign? It was a brave question, and an important one. David, there was no campaign. There was simply a presentation of facts to the board of directors. If you did good work under Richard's leadership, you will continue to do good work under mine. If you supported Richard because you genuinely believed he was the best leader for this company, I respect that loyalty. I paused, making eye contact with several faces in the crowd. But if anyone in this room thinks they can undermine our new direction or sabotage our client relationships because they are upset about the leadership change, they will find themselves looking for employment elsewhere very quickly. The message was clear, and the room remained silent. Now let me tell you about our plans for the future. Over the next hour, I outlined our new strategic direction. Kai presented his competitive analysis framework. Zoe explained our enhanced client relationship management system. Marcus shared financial projections that showed sustainable growth without the reckless spending that had characterized Richard's leadership. Melissa concluded by announcing structural changes that would give every department more autonomy and decision-making authority. When we finished, the questions came fast and furious. What about the Morrison situation? How do we win back the clients we lost? Will there be layoffs to cut costs? How do we know this new approach will actually work? I answered each question honestly and thoroughly, never promising more than we could deliver, never making claims we could not support with data. By the end of the meeting, the skepticism in the room had shifted to cautious optimism. As employees filed out, discussing the changes among themselves, I noticed something that filled me with quiet satisfaction. They were talking to each other. Across departments, across hierarchical levels, people were sharing ideas and asking questions about how they could contribute to our new direction. Richard's leadership style had created silos and competition within our own company. People hoarded information and protected their turf because they never knew when their contributions might be stolen or their departments might be scapegoated for larger failures. Our approach was already breaking down those barriers. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of strategic implementation and crisis management. We reached out to every client we had lost, not to make excuses or point fingers, but to ask genuine questions about what we could do differently. Many were willing to give us another chance, impressed by our new leadership team's humility and focus on their actual needs. We won back 4 of the 6 lost accounts within a month. More importantly, we began attracting new clients who had heard about our leadership transition and wanted to work with a firm that valued collaboration over ego. But the real test came 6 weeks after I became CEO, when Morrison and Associates made their biggest move yet. They poached 3 of our senior consultants with offers that included 50% salary increases and guaranteed bonuses. Worse, they convinced these employees to take confidential client information with them, giving Morrison insider knowledge about our ongoing projects and strategic plans. It was exactly the kind of crisis that would have sent Richard into a panic, probably resulting in knee-jerk reactions that would have made the situation worse. Instead, I called an emergency leadership meeting. "All right," I said, looking around the table at Kai, Zoe, Marcus, and Melissa. "Morrison just escalated this from a competitive situation to corporate warfare. How do we respond?" "Legal action," Marcus suggested immediately. "Those employees sign non-disclosure agreements. Taking client information to a competitor is grounds for prosecution." "Public relations offensive," Zoe added. "We need to control the narrative before Morrison spins this as evidence that our best people are jumping ship." "Counter-recruitment," Kai proposed. "If Morrison wants to play dirty, we identify their top performers and make them offers they cannot refuse." All solid suggestions, but I had a different idea. What if we do none of those things? The room fell silent. What if we use this as an opportunity to demonstrate exactly why our approach is superior to theirs? I stood and walked to the whiteboard, sketching out a strategy that would either prove our worth or destroy our credibility entirely. Morrison thinks they won by stealing our people and our information. But what they actually did was give us the perfect opportunity to show our clients why they should stay with us. I outlined a plan that was risky, bold, and completely contrary to conventional business wisdom. Instead of trying to hide the fact that Morrison had poached our consultants, we would announce it publicly. We would congratulate the departed employees on their new opportunities and wish them success in their future endeavors. Then we would demonstrate that our company's strength came not from individual superstars, but from collaborative systems that could adapt and improve even when key personnel left. "You want to bet the company's reputation on proving that we are better than our departed colleagues?" Marcus asked. "I want to bet the company's reputation on proving that our collaborative approach produces better results than Morrison's star system approach." Over the next month, we executed the most audacious client retention strategy in the company's history. Instead of assigning replacement consultants to the projects that our departed colleagues had abandoned, we created cross-functional teams that included representatives from every relevant department. Instead of trying to replicate the departed employees' work, we redesigned the projects entirely, incorporating insights and approaches that no single consultant could have developed alone. The results were extraordinary. Our client satisfaction scores increased by 30%. Project delivery times improved by 25%. And most importantly, 3 major clients who had been considering switching to Morrison decided to expand their contracts with us instead. The industry took notice. Harvard Business Review published a case study about our post-hierarchical leadership model. Forbes featured me on their 30 Under 30 list for transforming a traditional consulting firm into a collaborative powerhouse. The Wall Street Journal wrote an article about how our approach was disrupting the entire consulting industry. But the sweetest vindication came from an unexpected source. One of the consultants who had jumped ship to Morrison called me on a Tuesday afternoon in November. "Aria, this is Jake Morrison. I mean Jake Williams. I used to work there, with you at Stratton and Hale." "Hi Jake. How are things at Morrison?" A long pause. "Actually, that is why I am calling. I was wondering, is there any chance I could come back?" I leaned back in my chair, genuinely surprised. "What happened?" "It turns out that Morrison's approach is exactly what you would expect. They hired me for my knowledge of your clients and processes, but once they had that information, they basically sidelined me. I am working on projects that do not interest me, with people who see me as competition rather than colleagues. And the 50% salary increase? Means nothing when you hate going to work every day." I considered his request carefully. Jake had been a solid consultant, and his departure had been motivated more by money than by any fundamental disagreement with our direction. "I appreciate you calling, Jake. But you understand that trust is earned, not given. If you came back, you would be starting over in terms of proving your loyalty to this team." "I understand completely. I made a mistake, Aria. Morrison sold me a dream that turned out to be a nightmare." "What about the client information you took with you?" Another long pause. "I never used it. I could not bring myself to actually betray people who had trusted me, even after I had already left." 2 weeks later, Jake Williams returned to Stratton and Hale Consulting at his previous salary level, with a probationary period that would allow both sides to rebuild trust gradually. His return sent a clear message to the industry. People were not just willing to work for our company, they were willing to take pay cuts to come back to it. By the end of my first year as CEO, we had not only recovered from the Morrison attacks, but had grown by 40%. We had opened 2 new offices, hired 35 new employees, and established partnerships with international firms that were eager to learn from our collaborative approach. But success brought new challenges. As our reputation grew, we began attracting attention from larger competitors who saw our approach as a threat to their traditional business models. We received takeover offers that would have made everyone on the leadership team millionaires several times over. We turned them all down, not because we did not want financial success, but because we understood that our company's value came from something that could not be purchased: the trust and collaboration that we had built together. One evening in December, exactly 1 year after Richard's departure, I was working late in my office when Melissa knocked on the door. "Sorry to interrupt, but there is someone here to see you." "At this hour? Who is it?" "Richard Halden." My first instinct was to refuse the meeting. Richard had made it clear during our last conversation that he considered my success to be temporary, and my leadership philosophy to be naive idealism. But curiosity got the better of me. "Send him in." Richard entered my office looking different than I remembered. Gone was the arrogant swagger that had once defined his presence. He seemed smaller somehow, more uncertain. "Hello, Aria." "Richard. This is unexpected." "I am sure it is." He gestured toward the guest chair. "May I sit?" "Of course." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our shared history filling the space between us. "I have been following the company's progress," he said finally. "The Harvard Business Review article, the Forbes recognition, the client growth statistics. And I wanted to congratulate you." I studied his face, searching for sarcasm or hidden agenda. I found neither. "Thank you. I also wanted to apologize." That genuinely surprised me. "For what?" "For not seeing what you were capable of. For taking credit for your work. For treating you and others like tools instead of partners." Richard looked around the office that had once been his domain, taking in the changes I had made, the awards I had earned, the photos of our expanded team. I spent the last year consulting for smaller firms, trying to rebuild my reputation. Do you know what I discovered? What? That my approach worked in a different era, when information was scarce and decision-making was necessarily centralized. But in today's economy, collaboration is not just morally superior, it is strategically superior. He met my eyes directly for the first time since entering the office. You were right, and I was wrong. About leadership. About teamwork. About what makes a company truly successful. I felt no triumph in his admission, just a sad recognition of how much pain could have been avoided if he had reached this understanding years earlier. What are you doing now? I asked. Teaching, actually. Business ethics and organizational behavior at the local university, trying to help the next generation of leaders avoid the mistakes I made. That sounds meaningful. It is. And it has given me perspective on how badly I failed as a mentor and leader. Richard stood to leave, but paused at the door. For what it is worth, Arya, I always knew you were special. I was just too insecure and threatened to acknowledge it. After he left, I sat alone in my office, processing the strange closure of our professional relationship. Richard's apology did not erase the years of frustration and stolen credit. But it did provide a kind of resolution that I had not realized I needed. The man who had once called me replaceable had just acknowledged that I had not only replaced him, but had surpassed everything he had ever accomplished. As I prepared to leave for the evening, I took one final look around my office. The mahogany desk that had once symbolized Richard's power now represented something different. The possibility of leadership based on respect rather than fear, collaboration rather than competition, truth rather than convenient lies. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new tests of the principles that had brought us this far. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. I had proved that talent, when combined with integrity and determination, could overcome even the most entrenched systems of professional abuse. I had proved that replaceable was just another word for underestimated. And I had proved that sometimes, the best revenge is not just success, but the kind of success that makes your former oppressor want to become a better person. The city lights twinkled below my office windows as I gathered my things and prepared to go home. Somewhere in those illuminated towers, other young professionals were fighting their own battles against dismissive bosses and toxic workplace cultures. I hoped my story would reach some of them. I hoped it would give them the courage to document their achievements, build their alliances, and prepare for the moment when they too could transform from the dismissed to the indispensable. Because in the end, that is what this story is really about. Not revenge, but transformation. Not destruction, but creation. Not replacing someone out of spite, but replacing someone because you have built something better. My name is Arya Blackstone. I was once called replaceable. Now I am irreplaceable. And if you are fighting your own battles against those who underestimate you, remember this. They are not wrong because they fail to see your worth. They are wrong because they fail to understand that worth is not given by others. It is built by you, day by day, decision by decision, until the evidence becomes so overwhelming that even your harshest critics must acknowledge the truth. You are not replaceable. You are not a cog in someone else's machine. You are the architect of your own professional destiny. And when the moment comes to prove it, you will be ready. The elevator doors closed behind me as I left Stratton and Hale Consulting that evening, carrying with me the satisfaction of knowing that tomorrow, I would return not as someone fighting for recognition, but as someone who had earned the right to define what recognition means. Richard had taught me that leadership could be a tool of oppression. I had chosen to make it an instrument of liberation. For myself, for my team, and for everyone who refuses to accept that their dreams are too big for other people's small imaginations. That is the real victory. Not just winning the game, but changing the rules so that the next person does not have to fight the same battles you fought. The story ends here, but the legacy continues. Every day, in offices around the world, someone like me is gathering evidence, building alliances, and preparing to transform their workplace from a hierarchy of fear into a community of collaboration. And when they succeed, as I know they will remember the lesson that Richard Halden taught me through his failures. The only thing truly irreplaceable is the courage to demand better. If this story of transformation and triumph inspired you, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of people who refuse to accept the limits others tried to place on them. Your support helps us share these powerful stories of courage, determination, and ultimate victory. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of those who believe that no dream is too big and no dreamer is too small.